In this tutorial, we'll look at the various modeling techniques that will be used to create the trout model you can see on the screen. We'll look at the required vectors that will be used to create the underlying fish shape and the methods for adding the detail to give a truly realistic look. So we're going to start by closing this part and then opening a new one. So with this, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be 12 inches in width. It's going to be 4 inches in height, 3/4 inches thick. The Z0 will be from the material surface, and our XY datum will be in the lower left hand corner, and we're using a high modeling resolution. So with that, now I have my workpiece on the screen and I need to think about building the trout shape. So a good place to start is with us bringing in the image, and then we can look to start creating the detail on top. So with that, I'm going to come up to the import bitmap, and I'm going to pick here the rainbow trout JPEG. So with that, that'll be read in and located into the center of the workspace. Now we can clearly see that our fish is not big enough for the size of our job space. So the first thing we need to do is to scale that up. So under the transform object, set selected object size, link XY is switched on because I'm just going to vary the height and I want the width to proportionally increase too. So I'm going to increase that up to 4 now and apply, and we can see that we have the fish shape correctly located in the center of the screen. At this point, we need to be considering the vectors that we're going to need to create in order to start forming the underlying shape. So we would think of maybe creating one for the body, some for the fins, maybe around the face and the eye, and piece that together probably manually and then smoothing to create the necessary shape. But given the time constraints of this demo, I'm actually going to read in the vectors that we'll be using to create the underlying shape. So under the file operations, I'm going to select the file import and bring in an EPS file. Similarly could be a DXF, DWG, etc. But in this case, it's an EPS file. We can see those vectors highlighted over the top of the underlying image, and these represent those sort of shapes that we're going to use to create all the different features such as the fins and main body. Note that the vectors, certainly when we look for instance at this fin that I'm concentrating on at the end, that the vector actually passes into the main body shape because we will be creating this as a separate component and want to merge this into the body. Therefore we've got an overlap between these two regions. Okay, so the next stage for me is to start looking at layers because we're going to add some control both in terms of our levels and layers. So here we're going to come up and take a look at how we're going to organize our vectors. So from the drop down, we have 3 layers. The original bitmap layer, which the existing bitmap came in and that layer got created. We have the original layer 1, which was created when the part was first created, and we have the new layer onto which those vectors have been placed. So what I'm going to do firstly is just rename this, and we're going to call this just outline, okay? And then we're going to take a selection of these vectors and put them onto layer 1 and rename that. So I'm just going to take the vectors that will form the 2 rail sweep surface. I'm going to shift and pick the other vector here and then the 2 cross sections, and we're going to move to layer 1, okay? And then I'm just going to come up now and just rename this. So this is going to be called basic shape. So this is going to be the underlying basic shape. So with that, we will now move those vectors onto that layer. So just to double check, we can of course switch the bitmap off, we can switch the basic shape off or back on, and we've got our outline. Okay, so those are the different forms, and we're going to start by taking a look at the basic shape. So with this, we have 2 contours that represent the sort of main drive rails for our 2 rail sweep surface, and we've got some cross sections. So with that, I'm now going to select the 2 cross sections that we have, come into the modeling tab and select the 2 rail sweep. So I've already got my rail selected, so I can go straight to use selection. Just going to check the direction is correct on both. I'm going to scale cross sections with width, so in other words we'll get a greater shape in the middle or a higher shape, and then narrower where there is a shorter distance between the 2 vectors. And I'm not going to scale to height. I'm going to let the natural flow, and then we can always amend the height if required. And we're going to be adding this on, and the name would be basic shape. Okay, so that's the underlying basic shape we're going to be creating. And I'm now going to select the cross section that I want to use. So I'm going to pick that up now, and apply is now highlighted, and we can get that underlying shape. So let's take a look by tiling the view horizontally so we can see the model both in 2D and 3D. So if we just rotate the 3D now, we've got quite an interesting shape where we can see it's increasing in the area where the width between those rails is greater, and narrowing or lower where they are closer together. But I don't really like the fact that the curve profile is being used throughout the whole model. Certainly the tail should not have this shape. It should be a very much flatter shape. So with that, we've got the extra cross section that we're going to include with this surface. So with that now, I'm just going to select that new cross section and then come across to the end of this model here and just click on the end. Okay, and that will add that in. So what we're going to essentially do is progress from the front end through to the back end, transitioning into this shape. So if I apply that now, you can see that suddenly we've got, not really the shape required. Okay, so we need to add in a little bit more control. So what ideally we want to do is keep the rounded shape at the front, keep it rounded through to about 3/4 of the way down the fish, then transition from here into a flat region in the middle, and then continue flat through to the end. Okay, so this is how we'll do it. We'll pick up the original contour and just make sure that we've definitely got that located on the front. We're going to transition it through and keep it rounded through to about here. Okay, we're then going to pick up the new cross section and have that transition between this profile and here, okay, roughly across the middle, and then we'll just keep it all the way to the end. Okay, so we should get a nice rounded shape here, transitioning from the rounded shape to the flat shape and continuing flat through to the end. So when we apply that now, we can see that we've got that desired shape rounded, we've got the transition into the flat, and then the flat being maintained through to the end. So that does represent really quite a nice realistic outline, but of course we do need to trim it up to the shape of the fish. So with that, I'm going to close down the form now and just come across to our component tree here, and as you can see, we've got our component called the basic shape, and I'm actually going to create this level and rename it as basic shape 2. Okay, and now we can look to just take this original 3D model and trim this up to one of the outline shapes. With the components selected, I'm going to come up and switch on my outline vectors and shift and pick the perimeter vector for the trout, and come across to our modeling tools and select the clear area of selected component outside selected vectors, which will essentially trim the component to the vector. So that's trimmed it away now, so you can see that we've got a sort of wavy shape at the bottom there. So that's trimmed our original sort of main 2-rail sweep surface to the external vector. So with that, I'm now free to start thinking about the other components, such as the eye, the gill, the sort of fins, and of course the detail that we need to add on top. So I'm going to come across and just select the eye vector and across to the modeling tools and the shape editor. The shape editor, we're going to use the rounded profile, but we've increased the angle up to 90, so it's going to give a nice sharp sort of mating point with the main shape. And we're going to select a base height of 0. The final height will be limited to a height of just 50 thou, so scale to height is switched on with 50 thou set, and we're going to add this component to it, and we're going to call it eye. So I'm going to switch that on to eye and apply, and we can see if we zoom in that we have a nice sort of rounded shape that's been added on to the trout. So the next stage is to start another new component and then come in and select the vector for the gill. So in the 2D view, I've selected that vector now. We're going to use the same shape profile, but in this case, I'm going to use just a very shallow angle of 5. We're not going to use the scale to height option, but actually change that to the no limit. So essentially, we're just going to add a nice gentle raise to the profile. And we're going to once again add the component, and this is going to be called gill, and just apply onto the model. So at the moment you can see that something has been created, but if we have a look at the 3D view, we can barely see that. So it has lifted it up a little bit, but we can't really see it. So what we need to do is to change something about the model here to give it a bit more definition, in particular the edge where it sort of goes from the gill to the main body shape. We need a little bit of a hard edge. So to do that, we're going to use the tilt command. So I'm going to switch on tilt, come up to our 2D view here and hit set on the menu. So now I'm going to set the 2 points that define the tilt direction. So basically from the front to the back, and we are going to specify just an angle of 1, and you can see that's immediately lifted that back edge now. So we can see that there. And that's given a nice edge. We do need to soften this up and transition it between the two a little better at the top, but I'm very pleased with that model. So I'm going to close out that now, and we need to think about really trimming the new model, the new sort of gill model, to the main body. So we looked before at taking a component and trimming it to a vector. We can also do this by taking a component and trimming it to another component. So I'm going to shift now and double click and pick the main body. So essentially that will be the trimming vector or the trimming component, and use the same command, and that will clear away the front. So we've nicely trimmed away the front of the gill now, and we've got this nice continuous profile as it goes round the trout. Okay, so the next stage is to look at sort of smoothing the transition between the gill and the main body. So I'm just going to double click to select just the gill there and come across to the smooth command. So I'm going to select the sculpt visible model, okay, which will put us into this sort of sculpting mode. I'm just going to twiddle the view now so I can just move this into position so we can get a better idea of what is happening. And I'm going to just go back to the smooth command now and can start smoothing, but I need to specify my diameter, strength and smoothness. So I've got these roughly correct, about 50% on strength, roughly around about sort of 60 on the slider for diameter, and the smoothness I'm going to have this increased, and I can start smoothing. Okay, so as I start going around, you can see that as it goes around this front edge, it's not really smoothing around the front, and it's not actually transitioning very far into the existing model. In other words, it's just trying to refine the smoothing from within inside that current component. So I'm going to switch that off now, okay, and you'll see the difference. So as I bleed out, and you'll see this actually in the 2D view, how much is bleeding out. And I can just now start to really apply a lot more smoothing there and come round the front, okay. So we're going to smooth the front, but then we can also limit this at a later point. So I'm just going to come around here and transition that through. So I'm quite pleased with what we've got there, and what we now need to do is to just essentially grade the top edge so it sort of feathers into the main body, and gradually by the time it gets to this area here, we've got a sort of a gill shape. So this sort of upper top right region needs to be feathered out into the main body. So I'm just going to increase the strength here a little bit, and we're just going to sort of feather this out. So I'm just going to sort of feather across here, and I'm just going to sort of continue with this until it meets that midpoint there, or sort of the round in the middle. So essentially I'm just going to feather that out and just sort of transition into there. So at the moment I'm sort of happy with that, so I'm going to keep that now, okay, and you'll see once that's finished, and just okay that, we can see the feathering in the 2D view there, and we can see the amount of smoothing that we've done, and the fact that when it gets to this sort of far right hand edge of the gill, it then starts to become more prominent, sweeping down. Okay, so I just need to trim out the gill to the main body, so I'm just going to double click to select that component, shift and double click to pick the main body or basic shape, and then come up and select the tool to clear area of selected component outside vectors. And we've trimmed that away now. So if I just double click on the background, we can see that we've got this nice shape with a nice smooth transition on the top, and it's sort of slightly more prominent on the back edge of the gill at the bottom there. Okay, so we've made the necessary modifications to the gill, and now we can start to move on and look at doing the fins. Okay, so let's start by selecting the vector that will represent the first fin, fin 1, and move across to the shape editor. And we're going to pick a rounded shape profile of just 30 degrees. We're going to have a base height set to 50 thou just to lift the fin slightly off the page. The final height is not going to be scaled but set to no limit, so depending upon the width of the vector we will get variable height. And we are going to switch off tilt to start with, and as you can see here, we've got it currently adding into the model, so we need to set this to merge, which we can see there, and I'm going to call this fin 1 as the first fin. So I'm sort of happy with the shape here, but not with the way that it's transitioning into the base shape. We need it to come in a little bit further up on the side of the base shape, and at the moment it's either looking like it's disappearing on the other side or just transitioning directly into the bottom. So with that, I'm going to hit tilt now. Okay, now that's going to automatically pick up the parameters we've got here. I'm just going to set the direction. Okay, so I want to tilt it along this line here, so from tip to base, and we can see that it's currently set to 7.5. So we've got a little bit of the fin just popping out there, but I think with a little bit of late smoothing that will be okay. Okay, so we've got a little bit of vertical face there, but that's not a problem. If I reduce that down too much, then of course this fin will slip down the base and not give us quite such a good effect. So with that, I'm happy, and I'm going to say start new component, and we're going to sort of move across now to the fins on the bottom. So with this, select the small fin, which actually happens to be one that's sort of round the other side of the fish, so we don't need to add any tilt with this. So we're going to use 30 degrees as the angle. The base height is going to be 50 thou, no limit, no tilt, going to merge in, and this will be fin 2. So we apply that in, and we can see that's nicely on the base there, as if it's disappearing around the other side of the fish. So I can now go ahead and say start new component, and we're going to pick the sort of larger fin that happens to be on this side, and we're going to use the same rounded shape, 30 degrees, 50 thou as the base height, no limit. We're going to switch off tilt to start with, and we can see that immediately sort of merging in with the existing model. This is going to be called fin 3, and one thing I do need to do is address the fact that we have this quite sort of steep face here. We need to make sure the fin is transitioning in up onto the base shape, so we do need to apply a tilt. So I select tilt now, go to set, and just set the direction, and it's currently set to 4.8 as an angle, and if we just twiddle that down, you can see that there. And of course, if I actually decrease this down to 4 and just apply it, that will actually lower that, but of course it does lower the model in the actual base shape, but I think that's still an okay effect, and it means that we don't have to do quite so much smoothing here. So moving along to what will be fin number 4. So I'm going to start new component now, pick up this fin at the back end here, and we're going to use just a slightly lower angle, so from 30 down to 20. We've changed the base height from 50 thou to 30 thou, no limit set to final height. I'm just going to switch off tilt for the minute, and this will be fin 4, and apply. So we can see that there now transitioning. And now the reason we don't need 50 thou and only 30 thou is of course we have a slightly thinner portion of the base shape here, so we don't need to have such an increase in the base height. So with this, I am going to apply a little bit of tilt. So I'm going to select that tilt now, and it's currently set to 3 degrees. And if I just tilt that down now, you can see there is a little bit popping out here, but I think we'll get away with that. I might just go down to say 2.75 and apply just to lower that out. Okay, and I think this bit will be taken care of with some smoothing at a later point. So that's fin 4. I'm happy with that. I can go ahead and say start new component now. So we've done the ones on the base here, and we can now look to create the ones on the top edge of the base shape. So coming across now and just lowering this down, and we're going to come in and pick this small fin here. And once again, I'm going to be using 20 degrees. Keep that same base height because obviously it's thinner at that base edge. And no limit, and we're not going to apply any tilt, and this is going to be called fin 5, and we'll just apply that now, and we can see that's nicely coming into the base there. So with that, I can now say start new component, okay, and move across to what will be the fin on the top. So I'm just going to move this across now, select that fin, come up to the create shape, and we're going to fill in 15 degrees again. Our base height is increased to 50 thou because as you can see here, we've got quite a sizable thickness to our fish there. And I'm going to not tilt this particular component. We are going to merge this in, and this is going to be fin 6. So I'm just going to apply that now. So we can see that immediately go in there. So I think that looks good. And if we just close out the form now, we can see that we have what is certainly getting there. It's a lot more realistic. We still lack a lot of the detail there. But as you can see here, we've got the gill, the eye, the fins, the base shape, the tail is starting to come together. But of course we do need to start looking at adding some detail to give it the more realistic view. Before we go on to apply a lot of the smaller detail, we ought to really look at applying some global smoothing over the whole of the trout and some interactive smoothing to help with the blend of the fins into the main body. So to move forward with this, it may be best to consider the whole of the trout currently as a single entity. Now all the items are displayed as shown in the component tree here, and what I'm going to do is to actually insert a new level, and this is going to be renamed now. I'm going to call this trout, okay, and we have that as being active, shown in dark blue. And I'm going to take all the components that are currently displayed in the 3D view and turn them into a single component. So selecting the create component from visible model, that adds this new model into the level. So I'm just going to switch off the existing one, basic shape, and then rename the copy, and that's going to be called basic trout. Okay, so it lacks a lot of the detail really. Okay, so we've got that basic trout, and now I'm ready to start just applying a little bit of gentle smoothing to start with. So I'm going to select it from the menu, come up to the apply smoothing filter. Okay, now with that we've got this slider, so whether you want to go from min right the way through to max where we get the greatest amount of blending, but we'll lose a bit too much of the detail, so I'm going to come down roughly around about the 30% marker. Okay, so with that I'm happy with the result, but I still need to do a little bit, you can see on the tip of the two fins here, maybe a little bit on the base, to help with the transitioning of those fins into the main body. So I'm going to OK that now, and once again select it from the menu and then come into the interactive smoothing. But what I'll do first is just get it into a position where I want to apply the smoothing, and then select the command, and we're faced with a number of different options. Of the one that we want to take a look at is to smooth. So with this I've got my diameter set roughly correctly around about the 50 mark, and similarly with strength, and our smoothness up around about the 70 mark. So you can see the size of my sort of smoother on the screen, and I'm just going to just start sort of massaging the data here, and you can see there that we're just helping the sort of transition of that fin into the base shape. So I'm happy there. Maybe just apply a little bit more smoothing with the bottom one there. You can see it's a little bit hard edged, but if we just apply a little bit of smoothing there, that's starting to look good. Okay, and I'm just going to do the same here with the base. So we can see there we've got quite a nice sort of smooth transition between the three fins and the main shape. Okay, so I'm happy with that result. I'm going to keep that and then OK. So we're now in a position to really start considering how we're going to be adding the detail on top of this particular trout. We currently have, no little blemishes or none of the details on the gills exactly, so we ought to think about the best way to do that. Now, there are actually a couple of different ways we can take a look by grabbing the image, overlaying the image on top, and then using the interactive sculpting. And then we'll look at a really cool tool, which is the ability to take the bitmap and sort of reverse engineer it into a 3D shape and then apply that shallow 3D shape over the top of the whole fish. Okay, so let's deal with the first of those two options. Let's select the image and then shift and double click to select the model in the 3D view, and come across to the modeling tools and select the sculpt visible model. So with this, I have already set the model image to be shown as an overlay, so you can see the image over the top, and I have the ability to make that stronger or weaker depending upon the quality of the image. So I'm going to specify that roughly around about the 30%. I'm just going to twiddle the view to just zoom in onto the gill area here, and I'm going to start by applying some removal of material. So I'm just going to select the removal there, probably just tone the diameter down and tone the strength down to make it not too severe, and just come in now and just start sort of coming in and just applying with my hand some details. I can then sculpt at the bottom. Okay, I may actually just increase the strength now just for this sort of dots here, and I can come in and just start applying a lot of the detail. But of course, this looks to be a fairly painful process. It depends really on the scope of what you're trying to do. If I switch off the image, you can see that we started to add in some of that detail, but just literally overlaying that image on top and being able to begin sculpting away. I see that really as being very helpful if you want to add some sort of fine details, rather than what we're trying to do is to add detail across the whole of the trout. So I'm going to cancel that now and just remove that. And we need to think really about a different option, which is to take the whole of the selected image and see if we can create a shallow 3D relief that we can then put that over the top of the existing trout model. Okay, so we have the image selected in the 2D view, and I'm going to come across and select from my menu the command create component from selected or imported bitmap. We imported this bitmap as really the first thing we did with this project, so I don't need to import it. So I can just select that command now, and you can see in the 3D view it's immediately generated a 3D component based on the sort of grayscale image of the image that we have selected at the top of the screen. So from that, I'm just going to switch off the base trout shape, and then we can see the component we have. So based upon the colors that we have in the 2D view, we are getting different depths in the 3D view. But as you can see, we have a little bit too much detail here, we have a little bit too much depth, and we have a little bit too much noise. So with that, I'm just going to select the component from the tree and come up to our smoothing command. So with that, it's going to immediately apply, in this case, 50%, which looks good. We've kept a lot of the detail. We've still got a few of the smaller blemishes that if I actually turn this up to 100%, we start to wash it out and don't get all the detail we require. So 50% seems to be about right. So with that, I'm going to just OK that now. But of course, as you can see, we have a little bit too much depth, and it will be a little bit too severe if we overlay this on top of the underlying trout. So I'm actually going to select the model from the tree again and come into properties. So we can see here that the current shape height is almost 150 thou, and we're just going to tone this down now to 50 thou. So as I sort of tab through, you can see now that it's just generated a very shallow relief. Okay, and you can see that looks rather nice. So with that, I'm just going to close out of the form. And this is really where it starts to get exciting. So you can see simply that we have this very shallow component representing the detail that we can see in the 2D image above it. Now I'm going to simply switch on the base trout, and suddenly the fish comes alive. So we've overlaid this really nice, simple, shallow texture on top of the underlying trout. So it looks great there. We have some noise around the outside that we need to trim away, so that's dead easy. The current rainbow sort of texture is selected. I'm just going to shift and pick the basic trout. So I'm going to trim, I'm going to use the basic trout model to trim the texture. So I'm going to come back up to the menu now and just clear area of selected component outside, and then we can see that's been trimmed away, and we can have a look at that in full screen and just double click, and we can see that we have a wonderful 3D model representing the trout, and that's been simply taken from a 2D image. So that shows us the strength of Aspire to take a flat 2D image, be able to create some vectors, create some shapes, and combine that with a very shallow 3D texture that we've laid on top of this project.